I never thought my son-in-law's words would strike so deeply. Yet when he told me I should disappear, it felt like every sacrifice of my life had been erased in an instant. I had spent decades building a business with my hands, raising my daughter without complaint after her mother abandoned us, and giving her everything I had so she would never feel the emptiness I carried. I thought loyalty meant something, that devotion through sleepless nights and endless work shifts would be remembered with gratitude. But instead, I was treated as though I was nothing more than a burden. In front of others, he hinted that I no longer belonged. And in private, he told me directly that my presence embarrassed him, and that it would be better if I sold everything and left quietly. The humiliation was not only in his words, but in my daughter's silence, because she stood beside him without defending me, as if all those years of sacrifice had been a temporary favor rather than the foundation of her entire life. I carried the weight of shame on my shoulders that night, returning to an empty home where the walls seemed smaller than ever before. Yet within that silence, something clearer than anger began to form. I realized that disappearing would not mean surrender, because I still held the documents that proved foresight matters more than cruelty, and those papers contained conditions neither he nor my daughter expected. They thought my departure would be their triumph, but I knew that one decision I had made years earlier would turn their arrogance into their undoing, and that knowledge gave me the strength to face the betrayal without collapsing. When I returned home that night, I sat in my study surrounded by the quiet that had once been comforting, but now pressed heavily against me, reminding me of every moment I had lived for someone else's future rather than my own. I thought of the years I had worked double shifts on construction sites, leaving before dawn and returning long after dark, my hands blistered and my body aching, yet still making time to sit at the kitchen table helping my daughter finish her homework because I never wanted her to feel abandoned. I remembered the birthdays I tried to make special even when money was tight, baking lopsided cakes because I could not afford store-bought ones, wrapping small gifts in newspaper when paper itself felt like a luxury, and watching her eyes light up, as though I had given her the world. Those moments had been my reward, proof that sacrifice mattered, proof that devotion carried meaning. But now they felt like fragile photographs left too long in the sun, fading with every cruel word spoken by the man she had chosen to stand beside. I thought of the nights I spent awake calculating bills and tuition costs, cutting corners on my own needs so she could have the chance to attend the school she dreamed of. And I remembered how proud I felt watching her walk across the stage at graduation with a smile that I believed was also for me. The silence of my house echoed with those memories, each one cutting deeper because now I knew they meant nothing in her new life, erased as though they had never happened. I tried to tell myself she was trapped by her husband's influence, that she still carried love for me beneath her silence. But the memory of her eyes during that confrontation haunted me because they were cold and distant, as though she had already chosen which part of her past to bury. I walked through the house and touched the worn furniture, the cracked armrest of the chair where she once curled up with storybooks, the dining table marked with scratches from school projects, and I wondered if she even remembered how much of her childhood was carved into this place. I realized then that betrayal does not come suddenly but grows slowly, hidden beneath polite words and practiced smiles, until one day it stands fully formed before you and demands that you vanish. The humiliation of being told to disappear was sharper because I knew how hard I had fought to remain, how many chances I had given up to remarry or pursue my own desires, because raising her had always been my first and only priority. Sitting alone in that quiet room, I finally admitted that my sacrifices had not been misplaced but misunderstood, treated as obligations rather than choices, and my heart ached with the weight of that truth. Yet within the ache was also clarity, because I realized that while love can be erased in someone else's story, the record of sacrifice remains if you have prepared for the day when memory fails. Years earlier, when I first established the trust fund, my lawyer had insisted on including clauses I thought unnecessary, protections that seemed almost insulting at the time. But now I saw them as the only proof that foresight can guard against betrayal. I had laughed when he spoke of respect clauses and conditions tied to family loyalty, believing my daughter would never cast me aside. But tonight I understood that wisdom sometimes hides in words we dismiss until the truth forces us to remember them. I sat at my desk and pulled open the drawer where the original documents rested, still neatly bound, and as I read the lines I once considered excessive, I felt a calmness begin to steady me. Every clause was a reminder that dignity can be defended not with anger, but with preparation. And though humiliation had cut me deeply, I knew that I was not powerless. They thought my silence meant defeat, but in reality, it meant patience. And patience was the weapon they had never expected me to wield. That night, I allowed myself one final moment of grief for the daughter I had raised and the man she had chosen to silence me. And then I closed the folder, knowing that the path forward was not about revenge, but about consequence. And that difference would be the reason I walked out with dignity while they stood trembling in shame. The next morning, I arranged a meeting with my lawyer, a man who had guided me through contracts and property disputes for more than 2 decades. And as I stepped into his office, I carried the weight of humiliation like a stone pressing against my chest. I explained what had happened at the family event, how my son-in-law told me I should sell everything and disappear, how my daughter stood by in silence, and how I returned home with a heart heavier than it had ever been. He listened carefully, his expression calm and professional, and reminded me that this was exactly why we had written protections into the trust fund so many years ago. At the time, I thought those clauses were unnecessary, even insulting, because I never imagined my own blood would treat me as though I were disposable. Yet now I saw his foresight clearly. He pulled out the original documents and pointed to the sections that mattered most, showing me how the respect clause bound them legally to acknowledge my role or risk losing access to the wealth I had built. Reading those words aloud filled me with a strange sense of strength, because the humiliation of being told to disappear was countered by the knowledge that my sacrifices had been shielded by law. My lawyer reminded me that these documents were airtight, reviewed by specialists, and signed freely, leaving no room for claims of ignorance or coercion. I told him about the years of small betrayals, the silence at family gatherings, the subtle erasures that prepared the stage for the moment when my son-in-law finally demanded I step aside. And he nodded with the weariness of a man who had seen too many similar stories. He explained that betrayal within families often grows in the shadows, masked by politeness, until one day it bursts into public cruelty, and that was why protection on paper mattered more than promises spoken in private. I sat there staring at the stack of documents and realized that though I had been treated as invisible, I was not powerless, because every line written in that trust spoke louder than their arrogance. My lawyer asked if I was ready to enforce the clauses, and though my heart ached at the thought of placing consequences on my own daughter, I understood that silence had already been her choice, and that dignity could not survive without boundaries. I agreed quietly, not with anger but with resolve, and he began outlining the steps we would take, from formal notifications to eventual court filings if resistance came. He warned me that the process would be public, that their humiliation would be visible to others, and I told him that this was not my wish but the natural result of their own decisions. For years I had chosen patience over confrontation, hoping that gratitude might surface. But now I understood that patience must end when dignity is mocked. Leaving his office, I carried the folder under my arm like a shield. No longer just a collection of papers, but the embodiment of every long night, every sacrifice, every moment of loyalty I had given. On the street outside, the air felt sharper, cleaner, as though I had taken the first breath of freedom in years, because for the first time I was not merely reacting to betrayal, but preparing to answer it with clarity. I walked past people rushing to their jobs and thought of all the mornings I had done the same, never considering that the legacy I built might one day be treated as unwanted baggage. Now I knew that what I carried was not only wealth, but proof. And proof has a weight far greater than pride or performance. That day I promised myself I would no longer be cornered into silence, because my dignity rested not in their approval, but in the law that recognized my sacrifices. The humiliation had not vanished, but it no longer controlled me, because I understood that betrayal had already written its own downfall, and I simply had to let the words of those documents speak when the moment arrived. That night, I returned to my empty house and sat in the same chair where I had once listened to my daughter's laughter, and I began piecing together the long chain of betrayals that had led me here. At first, they had seemed like small slights, moments easy to dismiss, but now I saw how they formed a pattern, each one preparing the ground for the humiliation I endured. I remembered the first time my daughter skipped visiting me on my birthday, claiming her husband had arranged a trip that could not be rescheduled, and how I told myself it was nothing, that life was busy and she would make it up later. I thought of the family gatherings where she introduced me to strangers without mentioning the years I raised her alone, and how I brushed off the sting by telling myself she was just distracted. I recalled the phone calls that grew shorter, the pauses before she returned my words, and the way she started using phrases that were not hers, lines that carried her husband's dismissive tone more than her own. Even the photographs displayed in her home spoke of erasure, pictures of her new family placed proudly on shelves while the ones of her childhood with me remained tucked away or missing altogether. Looking back, I realized that my son-in-law had been building his influence for years, gradually encouraging her to see me not as the foundation of her life, but as a shadow to be hidden. He had been clever, cloaking disrespect in charm, making himself appear like the provider of a bright new future while quietly pushing me further toward the margins. The cruel words he delivered were not born overnight, but were the harvest of seeds planted in countless subtle ways, watered by my daughter's silence and my willingness to ignore the signs. I sat in that quiet room and felt the weight of my mistakes, because loyalty had blinded me, and I had convinced myself that love could not fade so easily. The truth now was unavoidable, because I saw how every small betrayal prepared the stage for the moment when he finally told me to disappear. It was not only the words spoken at the event that broke me, but the realization that I had excused so many warning signs in order to protect the image of a daughter who had already begun rewriting her past without me. I could no longer tell myself these were misunderstandings, because the pattern was too clear. A deliberate erasure of my sacrifices, carried out step by step until I became invisible. That knowledge hurt more than the words themselves, yet it also gave me strength, because clarity strips away illusions and forces you to see betrayal for what it truly is. In that clarity, I understood that this was no longer about whether my daughter loved me, but about whether I respected myself enough to defend my place in the story I had built. Betrayal may erase love, but it cannot erase truth. And the truth was written in every memory of sacrifice, every receipt of tuition paid, every scar on my hands from years of labor. I realized then that my silence had been a mistake, not because it showed weakness, but because it gave them space to twist the narrative unchecked. I promised myself that night I would no longer ignore the signs or excuse the cruelty, because the pattern of betrayal could only be broken by confronting it with clarity and consequence. The documents in my possession were no longer just papers. They were the unshakable record of a life lived in sacrifice. And for the first time in years, I felt steadier knowing that patience was about to meet its moment. I sat in the dim light until dawn touched the window, my heart heavy yet certain, because I knew the next chapter would not be written by their arrogance, but by the truth I had guarded quietly all along. When the weight of clarity settled on me, I began to notice how the betrayal had reached beyond my family and into the business I had built with my own hands, because even there, the signs of erasure were spreading quietly. I heard from old colleagues that my son-in-law had begun making comments about how the company needed new leadership, suggesting that my methods were outdated and my presence held back progress. And although I no longer ran daily operations, those words cut deeply because I knew the years of sweat poured into those walls. I visited one of the construction sites where men I had trained decades earlier still worked, and their uneasy glances told me they had heard whispers too. Stories that I was preparing to retire and leave everything behind. Stories I had never spoken, but which clearly carried his influence. The humiliation of being treated as a fading relic reached me even in the workplace, where my reputation had once stood untarnished, and I realized that his campaign was not only to push me out of the family, but also to rewrite the story of my life's work. I thought of the early years when I carried steel beams with my bare hands, when I skipped meals to pay suppliers, when I stood ankle-deep in mud shouting orders to crews because rain threatened to destroy a deadline. And I remembered how those sacrifices created the stability my daughter enjoyed growing up. To see those memories dismissed as outdated pride was almost unbearable. Yet I understood that this too was part of the same pattern of betrayal, a deliberate effort to make me disappear in every sphere of my life. I gathered every piece of evidence I could find, from board meeting minutes where my contributions were erased to company newsletters where my name no longer appeared, and I added them to the growing folder in my study, because I knew proof would speak louder than wounded pride. The allies who still respected me pulled me aside quietly, telling me that although pressure was building, they had not forgotten who trained them, who stood beside them when paychecks were uncertain and accidents threatened livelihoods, and their loyalty gave me strength. I realized then that reputation can be attacked by whispers but defended by records, And I had more records than they could ever imagine, because every invoice, every contract, every signed agreement bore my name across decades. The humiliation of being slowly erased still burned, but beneath it was the steady calm of a man who knows the foundation he built cannot be destroyed by gossip. I walked through the halls of my company headquarters, hearing voices hush when I passed, and I carried myself with the same discipline I had used on construction sites, because I knew patience was my greatest tool. They thought my silence meant weakness, but it was simply the space I gave them to reveal their true intentions. And every careless word they spread only strengthened the case I was preparing. I returned home each evening heavier with sorrow, but also steadier with resolve, reviewing the collected evidence like a craftsman sharpening tools before the final task. In those quiet hours, I reminded myself that this battle was not about revenge, but about restoring balance, about showing that respect cannot be erased without consequence. My son-in-law wanted to claim my legacy as though it were his own, but what he never understood was that legacy is not inherited through arrogance, but proven through sacrifice, and sacrifice leaves a record that cannot be buried. Each day that passed, the folder on my desk grew thicker, and with it my certainty grew, because I knew the storm he created would eventually turn back on him. And when it did, the proof of my life would speak louder than all his careless whispers. As the folder of evidence thickened, I found myself turning more often to the people who had stood with me through the long years. Because betrayal has a way of isolating you until you remember that loyalty is never entirely erased. My lawyer became my anchor during those days, reminding me that the respect clause buried within the trust fund was not just a formality, but a shield carefully crafted for moments exactly like this. He explained again how the clause required my daughter and her husband to uphold my role publicly and privately if they wished to benefit, and how their dismissive words and actions had already triggered the protections I once thought unnecessary. I listened carefully as he outlined the process, from serving notices to filing motions, and although the legal language was heavy, the weight it carried felt like the steel beams I had once lifted, burdensome yet essential for building something that would endure. Outside the office, I found unexpected strength from old colleagues, men who had known me when I was just another worker in the mud and dust, and they reminded me quietly that they had not forgotten who had kept food on their tables during hard years. One by one, they offered to testify if needed, to put their names beside mine and speak of the sacrifices I made, not because I asked, but because they saw clearly how history was being twisted against me. Their loyalty steadied me in ways I cannot fully describe, because humiliation has a way of convincing you that everyone has turned away. Yet here were voices ready to stand when truth demanded it. Even neighbors who had watched me raise my daughter alone, who remembered the years when I left before sunrise and returned long after sunset, offered small gestures of support, telling me that no matter what stories were being spread, they knew the truth of what I had done. Slowly, I realized that betrayal may be loud, but loyalty whispers steadily, and those whispers become powerful when gathered together. I added their statements to the growing folder, each one another brick in the wall that would protect my dignity, and with every addition, my resolve grew stronger. I began to carry myself differently, no longer shrinking under the weight of humiliation, but walking with the quiet knowledge that I was not alone. My son-in-law may have thought he had erased me, but he had underestimated the depth of the foundations I built in both work and relationships. What struck me most was that I had never boasted of these sacrifices, never sought recognition. Yet when betrayal tried to erase me, the people who remembered stepped forward unasked, proving that respect rooted in truth does not fade easily. My lawyer smiled when I told him of these allies, explaining that such testimony would strengthen the legal case. But to me, it meant more than that. It meant my life's story still carried weight beyond my own memory. In those days, the line between humiliation and dignity blurred, because though I still carried the sting of betrayal, I also felt a rising calm, the sense that I was moving steadily toward justice without losing myself to anger. I realized then that patience was not just waiting, but preparing, building layer after layer of truth until it stood taller than any falsehood. Each evening, I returned to my study, opened the folder, and saw not only documents and statements, but the living record of a life built on sacrifice. And I understood that betrayal had given me something it never intended, a chance to let the truth be, seen in full. What once felt like an ending now felt like a transition, the point where humiliation would no longer define me but instead become the prelude to restoration. And I was determined to carry that knowledge forward without faltering. The weeks that followed were heavy with both sorrow and determination, because I knew the betrayal had cut deeply, but I also felt the quiet strength of preparation rising within me. My lawyer met with me often, spreading out the documents across his polished desk, reminding me that the respect clause written into the trust was not a suggestion, but a binding promise they had already broken. He showed me again how every public slight, every dismissal, every remark that treated me as invisible became evidence that their claim to my estate was weakened by their own actions. Listening to him, I felt steadier, because humiliation no longer seemed like a wound without remedy, but rather the foundation of a case that would restore what had been stolen in dignity. I gathered not only legal documents, but also testimonies from people who had seen my sacrifices with their own eyes. Men who had worked beside me on job sites when the rain poured and deadlines loomed. Neighbors who remembered the long years I raised. My daughter alone without complaint, and colleagues who had trusted me with their livelihoods when times were uncertain. Their voices mattered more than they knew, because they proved that my life had been more than silent sacrifice. It had been witnessed, and no betrayal could erase that. Each testimony was added to the folder on my desk, and with every page I felt less like a man cornered and more like a man reclaiming his place. At the same time, I began to notice how betrayal often reveals itself in patterns too clear to ignore. My son-in-law grew louder in his arrogance, boasting at gatherings that the future belonged to him, while my daughter echoed his words with nervous silence that betrayed her own unease. I watched from a distance, no longer expecting kindness, but recording carefully the small moments that would soon matter more than they realized. I reminded myself daily that this was not about vengeance, but about consequence. And consequence delivered through law carries a weight that anger can never match. Even in the darkest hours when I felt the ache of abandonment pressing heavily against me, I found reassurance in the allies who still stood near, their loyalty quiet but unshaken. My lawyer's calm voice became a lifeline, reminding me that patience is the truest strength in battles fought not with fists but with documents. He often said that betrayal burns quickly, but truth endures slowly. And though those words stung at first, I began to see their wisdom with each passing day. I walked through my home at night, touching the worn furniture that carried my daughter's childhood. And instead of drowning in grief, I began to feel gratitude that these walls still remembered even if she chose to forget. The respect clause in the trust had seemed unnecessary when it was written, almost an insult to the love I thought unshakable. But now I saw it as the most faithful ally of all, a record that could not be twisted by whispers or erased by arrogance. Betrayal may have silenced her voice and emboldened his cruelty, but it had also triggered the very protections that would undo them, and that irony gave me a strange sense of peace. The folder of evidence grew heavier each week, and so did my resolve, because I knew the day was coming when those papers would speak louder than any words I could ever deliver. In the quiet of my study, I realized that humiliation had been transformed into clarity, and clarity had been transformed into strength. And that transformation would be the reason I walked forward with dignity while they faced the weight of their own choices. The pressure around me began to build as my son-in-law grew bolder, certain that his vision of the future was unstoppable, and I watched him parade himself at public events as though he already carried the weight of my legacy on his shoulders. He spoke openly about new business ventures he would control, about how the family name would finally be modernized under his leadership, and I saw the way people began to nod, believing his words because they were delivered with the smooth confidence of a man who thought victory was already secured. My daughter remained at his side, her silence speaking more than any words could, her eyes avoiding mine whenever our paths crossed. And though the sight of her distance pierced me deeply, I reminded myself that I had already accepted the truth of her choice. At gatherings where I once sat proudly at the head of the table, I now found myself placed in the corner, introduced briefly if at all, treated as though I were a relic whose presence was tolerated rather than respected. The humiliation was sharp, yet it no longer carried the same power over me, because I had learned to see their arrogance as evidence rather than torment. Each dismissive gesture, each careless remark, each attempt to erase me became another stone in the foundation of the case my lawyer and I quietly built. What they mistook for weakness in my silence was in fact patience. And patience was the one weapon they never recognized until it was too late. I noticed too how greed began to reveal cracks in his performance, because the more he boasted, the more reckless his claims became. And whispers reached me of investments made with borrowed funds and promises extended beyond his ability to deliver. I heard of contracts signed hastily, of colleagues uneasy with his confidence, and I knew that arrogance often digs its own grave faster than any enemy could. Still, I remained quiet, watching as he tried to plant himself as the new patriarch of a legacy he did not build, his pride blinding him to the truth that the ground beneath him was not his to claim. Each evening I returned home, reviewed the growing folder, and reminded myself that dignity does not require noise, only steadfastness. My allies continued to provide quiet encouragement, some calling to share updates of his careless words, others reminding me that the truth was on my side even if appearances suggested otherwise. Their loyalty strengthened my resolve, because though betrayal had silenced my daughter, it had not erased the respect earned from those who knew the life I had lived. In those weeks, I carried myself differently, not as a man beaten down by humiliation, but as one who had already seen the end of the story, because I knew that the louder he shouted, the harder his fall would be when the truth emerged. The contrast between his arrogance and my calm became almost unbearable to watch, because I saw clearly how far he had wandered from reality, and I knew the time was approaching when patience would give way to consequence. What steadied me most was the knowledge that I did not need to raise my voice or fight for recognition, because the law had already preserved my dignity in black ink and signatures, waiting quietly to be revealed. They thought my silence meant disappearance, but in truth it meant preparation, and preparation is the mark of a man who builds foundations that endure storms. Each passing day, as their confidence grew, so did my certainty that humiliation would soon shift its weight, and I would no longer be the one standing in its shadow. The breaking point arrived at another family gathering, a celebration meant to display success and unity, yet it became the stage where my humiliation was sharpened into something unforgettable. I entered the hall quietly, taking my place near the edge as I had grown accustomed to, but even before I sat down, I could feel the weight of eyes measuring me as though I were an unwanted guest, rather than the man who built the ground beneath their lives. My son-in-law stood proudly at the center, speaking with the confidence of someone who believed he was untouchable, and his words carried an arrogance so sharp that it cut deeper than any private insult. He spoke of a future free from outdated traditions, a new era where leadership belonged to younger hands, and though he never named me directly, every sentence made it clear who he was discarding. My daughter smiled nervously at his side, her silence once again louder than his words, and I felt the room shift as people laughed at his jokes that reduced my sacrifices to relics of the past. In that moment, I felt the burn of humiliation so strongly that for a brief second I considered walking out and leaving them to their arrogance. But then I remembered the folder resting safely at home, the clauses written years ago, the evidence, collected patiently, and I steadied myself. I realized that anger would only feed their performance, while silence carried the weight of inevitability. I looked around the room and saw colleagues, neighbors, and even distant relatives who once respected me now watching carefully, their expressions caught between amusement and discomfort, and I knew they were witnessing more than entertainment. They were witnessing the final proof of betrayal. Every careless laugh, every dismissive gesture, every whispered remark etched itself into my memory, because I understood that what hurt me now would later stand as evidence when the truth was revealed. I sat quietly through the evening, absorbing every word, every glance, and though humiliation pressed against me, it no longer bent me, because I knew patience was nearly finished with its work. When the speeches ended and the music began, I slipped away unnoticed, walking out into the cool night air with my dignity intact, not because they respected me, but because I no longer needed their approval. As I walked home under the streetlights, I thought of the years I had sacrificed, the nights spent working through exhaustion so my daughter could live without fear, and I realized that betrayal had already written its own judgment. They believed they were erasing me, yet in truth, they were documenting their cruelty in front of witnesses who would not forget. That night in my study, I opened the folder and placed fresh notes inside, writing down every detail of the evening while the memory was sharp, because I knew the time was near when these words would matter more than their laughter. I felt sorrow, yes, but also a strange calmness, because I understood finally that I'd done all I could as a father, and that the story was no longer about whether they loved me, but whether I respected myself enough to defend what I had built. Betrayal had cornered me, humiliated me, and tried to erase me, but it had also unlocked the very protections I once thought unnecessary. As dawn crept through the window, I closed the folder and whispered a silent promise to myself. The next time they saw me, it would not be as a man tolerated in the corner, but as a man whose dignity had been restored by truth written in law. The notice was delivered a week later, crisp paper sealed with the weight of law, and I imagined his smirk as he read the opening lines before his eyes widened at the clauses he had never considered real. My lawyer had filed the motion to enforce the trust conditions, and the language was direct, stating that any act of public erasure or humiliation triggered forfeiture of claims. Their arrogance had handed me the proof required. Each word spoken at gatherings, each dismissal in public, all recorded and documented with precision. My daughter and her husband laughed at first, dismissing it as desperation, but I knew they had underestimated the strength of signatures and witnesses. For years they believed my silence meant weakness, but silence had only been patience waiting for its moment. As they prepared their rebuttal, mocking the seriousness of the documents, I sat quietly in my study knowing the storm they had created was about to turn back on them. Every sacrifice, every scar, every long night of labor now had a voice written in law, and soon the courtroom would hear it louder than their arrogance ever dared to speak. The notice arrived with the cold precision of law, and though I was not there to see his face, I could almost picture the smirk fading as he reached the section that spelled out the respect clause he had mocked without ever reading. My lawyer had filed the motion formally, attaching the documents we had preserved for years, and the language was exact. Any act of public erasure or humiliation against me triggered forfeiture of claims to the trust and assets. What he believed were clever words spoken at family gatherings had now become legal evidence, and the very laughter he once enjoyed turned into the rope tightening around his ambition. My daughter received her own copy, and though I never heard her reaction, I imagined the silence in their home as the truth settled between them, because no amount of charm or arrogance could erase a signature witnessed and notarized years earlier. At first they tried to dismiss it as desperation, treating the filing as the weak defense of an old man clinging to relevance. But I knew better. They had underestimated not only my patience, but the strength of foresight, because the documents carried a weight far greater than any performance or speech. Friends began to whisper about the legal notice, some shaking their heads in disbelief that he had walked directly into a trap laid by his own arrogance, while others quietly approached me to offer respect I thought had been lost. For the first time in months, humiliation no longer sat on my shoulders, because I knew the tide was turning. I sat in my study with the folder spread across the desk, reviewing every clause and every statement, and I felt steadier than I had in years. They thought my silence meant surrender, but it had only been the discipline of waiting for the right moment. Now the law would speak for me, louder and clearer than I ever could, and their arrogance would be exposed not by my anger, but by their own words echoing back in judgment. The storm they had built was finally beginning to shift, and I knew it would not be long before consequence arrived. The courtroom was filled with a quiet tension when the case was finally called, and I sat beside my lawyer with the calm of a man who had waited years for this moment. Across the aisle, my son-in-law leaned back with a smug expression, whispering to my daughter as though the outcome was already written in his favor. But I noticed the flicker of unease in her eyes. His attorney spoke first, painting me as outdated, stubborn, and unwilling to let go, describing me as a man clinging to control while the younger generation carried true vision. The words echoed through the chamber like the same dismissive laughter I had endured at family gatherings, yet now they no longer stung, because I knew what waited in our folder. When my lawyer rose, his voice was calm and deliberate as he laid the trust documents on the judge's desk, pointing directly to the respect clause. He read aloud the section that voided claims in cases of public disparagement, and the gallery leaned forward as if sensing a shift in the air. Witness statements were presented, photographs of gatherings where I had been mocked, and transcripts of remarks that reduced me to a burden. Each piece built upon the last, until arrogance was stripped bare as evidence of disrespect. My son-in-law shifted uncomfortably, his smirk fading as the weight of the clauses grew undeniable, and my daughter's hands trembled against the table as she realized what silence had cost her. The judge listened carefully, noting how the very words they had once used so casually now bound them. and a quiet murmur spread through the courtroom as the truth became undeniable. What once humiliated me now humiliated them, and I sat steady, knowing dignity was finally being restored. The judge's response carried the weight of finality, his voice steady as he declared that the respect clause was valid, enforceable, and already violated by their actions. He noted that public disparagement had been proven beyond doubt, citing testimony, photographs, and documented remarks that left no room for denial. My son-in-law's lawyer tried desperately to argue coercion and ignorance, but the judge dismissed those claims, reminding him that signatures witnessed and notarized could not be undone by regret. I sat quietly as the ruling was delivered, my hands folded on the table, not gloating but steady, because this was never about revenge but about restoring dignity that had been stolen from me. The assets I had built through decades of sacrifice were preserved, the trust secured against their claims, and their attempt to erase me collapsed in front of everyone they had once hoped to impress. My daughter stared at the desk, unable to meet my eyes, her silence now heavier than it had ever been, while her husband's bravado was reduced to muttered frustration that carried no weight in the chamber. Friends and acquaintances who had once doubted me now looked at me with quiet respect, and I felt the years of humiliation finally lifting. Betrayal had tried to erase me, but foresight and patience had given me the strength to endure until truth was revealed. And in that moment, I knew dignity had returned. When the gavel struck for the final time, I rose slowly, the weight of months of humiliation lifting from my shoulders, and I walked out of the courtroom not as a man erased, but as a man restored. Outside, the air felt sharper, cleaner, as though the world itself acknowledged the shift, and people who once avoided my gaze now offered small nods of respect. My son-in-law hurried past with his head lowered, his arrogance crumbled into silence, while my daughter followed behind him, her eyes fixed on the ground, unable to look at me. I felt no triumph in their downfall, only the quiet steadiness of knowing that truth had spoken louder than betrayal. The company I built remained intact. The assets I worked for decades to preserve were secure, and the trust I had once doubted proved to be the shield that guarded my dignity. I returned home to the same worn furniture, the same walls that had carried my daughter's laughter years ago, but the silence no longer crushed me. It steadied me. I realized then that sacrifice cannot be erased when it is protected by patience and foresight. And though betrayal had scarred me, it had not defined me. My dignity was no longer fragile, it was unshakable. And the story they tried to bury had become the record of their own undoing. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.